All right, folks, get ready for a really deep dive, deep into philosophy. You sent us a whole bunch of stuff about identity over time, and we figured, why not? Let's go straight to the source. We've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy right here.
And we're tackling a pretty fundamental question. How can something really change, and yet still stay the same?
Yeah, at first it sounds like, duh, obviously.
Yeah.
But the more you think about it, the weirder it gets. Like, if a thing actually changes, hasn't it, become something else entirely?
Exactly. And if it's not the same thing anymore, then what actually changed? It's a genuine paradox. The Stanford Encyclopedia even calls it, straight up, the paradox of change.
So we've got this paradox. How do we even begin to unpack this thing?
Well, a good place to start is by seeing how brilliant minds throughout history, the big names in philosophy, have tried to tackle this thing. Take Aristotle, for example. He had this idea of separating changes into two types: accidental changes and essential changes.
Accidental versus essential. Okay, I'm kind of following. But can you give me a real-world example of how that works?
Sure, picture a house. Let's say you decide to repaint the house, give it a fresh coat of paint, maybe a different color. That's what Aristotle would call an accidental change. It's still the same house, just with a different look, right? But what if the house burns down, completely destroyed, gone? That's an essential change. It's not a house anymore, it's just a pile of ashes.
Okay, so an accidental change doesn't really change what a thing is deep down. But an essential change, that changes its very being, its essence.
You got it. Aristotle thought these changes depended on a distinction between essential and accidental properties. An essential property is like a must-have feature. It's something, a thing absolutely needs to be that kind of thing. So for a house, maybe being a structure that provides shelter, that could be considered an essential property.
Right, so the house's houseness, like its fundamental purpose, that's essential. But the color of its paint, that's just accidental. It can change without the house, ceasing to be a house.
Exactly. But even way back then, philosophers were already debating whether it's always so easy to separate essential from accidental properties.
Yeah, I could see how that could get tricky. Like, what we consider essential might change depending on who you ask, right? Like, if I own a house, its location might be its most essential feature for me. Moving it would be a way bigger deal than slapping on some new paint.
You're raising a really key point. Are there objective, built-in essential properties? Or are they more about how we categorize and think about stuff? This is something we have to keep in mind as we explore these different theories of identity.
So, Aristotle gives us a starting point, a way to categorize changes. But it doesn't solve the whole paradox of change, does it?
Not completely, no. And to make things even more interesting, more complicated, we've got this principle called Leibniz's law, sometimes called the indiscernibility of identicals.
Ooh, a philosophical law. Now things are getting serious. What does Leibniz's law say?
Basically, it says if two things are truly, genuinely identical, they gotta have all the same properties, no exceptions.
So if A equals B, then anything that's true about A also has to be true about B, and the other way around. Seems simple enough.
It sounds simple, right? But let's see how this plays out in a classic thought experiment that's mentioned in the Stanford Encyclopedia. The cup and teacup scenario.
Cup and teacup. Okay, now you've got me hooked. What's the deal with this cup?
Imagine an ordinary cup, the kind with a handle, we'll call it cup. Now picture that same cup, exactly the same, but without the handle. That's teacup, just the cup part.
Gotcha. Cup equals the handle plus teacup.
Now let's say, oh no, the handle breaks off of cup. What's left is materially and spatially identical to teacup, right? Same shape, same atoms, same spot on the table.
So at this point, wouldn't we say that cup just is teacup now?
That's what we might think, yeah. But this is where Leibniz's law throws a wrench in things, makes it tricky.
How so? They seem like the same thing to me.
Well, after losing its handle, cup has the property of having once had a handle.
Right.
Yeah.
It definitely used to have a handle.
But teacup, on the other hand, never had a handle, ever. It was always just the cup part.
Ah, okay, I'm seeing the problem. Leibniz's law says identical things have to share all the same properties, but cup and teacup have this big difference in their pasts and the histories.
Exactly, and it gets even naughtier. Cup also has this property of being necessarily identical to cup, meaning it couldn't have been anything other than cup, right?
But how could teacup have that property? If they were separate before, how can teacup now suddenly be necessarily identical to cup? That seems like a contradiction.
And that is exactly the challenge. The cup and teacup problem shows how even simple changes, like a handle breaking off, can lead to these huge philosophical puzzles about identity. And this is what has led philosophers to come up with all sorts of creative solutions.
Oh, don't stop there. What are some of these philosophical solutions to the problem of identity over time? I can't wait to hear them. Okay, so we're stuck with this cup and teacup thing, and it's really messing with logic. How have philosophers tried to fix this whole identity problem over time?
Well, they're a creative bunch, and they've come up with a whole bunch of solutions. One that's pretty interesting is the concept of constitution.
Constitution, you mean like the rules of a country?
No, not quite, although it does have to do with structures in a way. The idea here is that maybe cup isn't exactly the same as teacup, identical, but it's constituted by teacup after the handle breaks off.
So they're not like totally the same thing, but one kind of forms or makes up the other.
That's it. Think of it like your body. Your cells are constantly changing, being replaced, but you're still you, right? Your body is constituted by those cells, even if they're not the same exact ones you had before.
That's a good example. It shows that the relationship between the parts and the whole can be really, really complex. What are some other ideas philosophers have come up with?
Another one is called relative identity, and this one's kind of radical. It says there isn't just one absolute identity.
Multiple identities. Okay, now you've got my attention.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
It's saying that things can be the same depending on how we're thinking about them. So is cup the same cup as teacup? That's different from asking if they're the same pile of atoms.
I see. We use the word same in all sorts of ways without really thinking about the nuances.
Right. Relative identity tries to capture that. Then there's also the idea of strict versus loose identity.
So cup and teacup aren't really the same in a strict philosophical sense,
Yeah.
but we can kind of loosely say they're the same in everyday talk.
Yeah, basically. Like, strictly speaking, they're different things, but in a casual way, we still call them the same cup, especially if we're not, getting all philosophical about it.
That makes sense. That's how we normally talk about things anyway.
Oh.
Are there any solutions that get even wilder?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's this idea called four-dimensionalism, and it changes how we think about objects entirely.
Do tell. I'm ready for my mind to be blown.
Four-dimensionalism says objects don't just exist in space, they exist in time, too. Think of, say, a loaf of bread. It has its length, width, height, the spatial dimensions. Four-dimensionalism says it also has a temporal thickness, stretching through time.
So instead of thinking of a cup as just this thing, we should think of it as, like, stretching through time with different versions of itself at different points.
Exactly. Just like bread has slices, it has temporal parts. Cup has a part with a handle and then later a part without it.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. So it's not the same cup changing, it's different temporal parts of it at different times.
Oh, that's the basic idea. It solves the paradox by saying there isn't really one object changing, but different slices of it in time.
That's pretty wild. But what about people who think objects can change over time and stay the same?
There's this view called surprise temporary identity, but it's controversial because it goes against Leibniz's law.
Because of the whole identical things share all properties thing, right?
Yeah.
How can something be temporarily identical to something else if they don't have all the same properties right then?
Exactly. People who believe in temporary identity have to find ways to deal with that. It gets really complex and metaphysical.
Sounds like a fascinating rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah.
But before we do, I want to go back to something you said earlier, how all of this connects to the idea of change itself.
Yes. The whole paradox of change is at the heart of all these identity discussions. It makes us rethink what it means for something to stay around over time while changing.
It's like we're digging into the very core of how we understand the world around us. So, are there any other mind-blowing examples of these identity puzzles? I'm always up for more.
Tons. A classic one is the statue and the clay problem, it asks. Is a statue the same thing as the lump of clay it's made of?
Ooh, that's a good one. He's like, they're the same stuff, same matter, but different things. How is that possible? If it's the same clay, shouldn't it be the same thing?
That's the big question. And it gets even trickier when we think about, what if we change the clay into something else? Is it still the same statue? This whole thing shows how matter and form can really mess with our understanding of identity.
That's a fantastic example. It shows how even simple objects can bring up really complex questions. And of course, we can't forget the ship of Theseus problem. That one always gets me thinking.
Yes, the ship of Theseus. If we slowly replace every piece of wood in a ship, is it still the same ship? What if we take all the old pieces and build a new ship? Which one is the real one?
Right, it makes you think about whether identity is, like, transitive. If A equals B and B equals C, then A should equal C, right? But with the ship of Theseus, that doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, exactly. It challenges this idea that identity is simple, a one-to-one thing. There can be multiple claims to identity, and figuring out which one wins is messy.
These thought experiments were making me realize how much I take for granted about how the world works. It seems like this concept of identity is everywhere, from objects to, well, ourselves.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to the concept of personal identity. What makes us the same person over time?
Now we're getting to the good stuff. What makes me, even though I change so much, is it my body,
Mm.
memories, my personality, or something else entirely? I need to know what philosophers say about this. All right, so we've been talking about identity over time for objects and stuff, and now we're getting into the really big question. Personal identity. What makes me the same person throughout my life, even though so much changes about me?
This is where it gets really fascinating. One of the most important figures in this area is John Locke. He made a distinction between same man and same person.
I'm guessing same man means like the biological being, the actual body.
Yeah.
But what do you mean by same person?
Well, for Locke, same person was all about consciousness, like particularly our memories. He argued that personal identity depends on having a continuous consciousness tied to being able to remember our past experiences.
So if I can remember playing with my toys as a kid, having certain experiences, those memories are part of what makes me the same person I am today, even though my body and lots of other things have changed.
That's exactly the idea behind what's called the memory criterion for personal identity. But philosophers are always looking for problems, and they found some with this too.
I can imagine. Memories aren't always reliable. We forget things, they change, get distorted. How can something so unreliable be the basis of our identity?
That's one issue. There are also situations where the memory criterion leads to some really weird conclusions. Like the classic example of the general, the lieutenant, and the schoolboy. The general remembers being the lieutenant remembers being the schoolboy, but the general doesn't remember being the schoolboy. So are they all the same person?
That's a tough one. If personal identity is all about a chain of memories, what happens if there's a break in the chain? Does the identity break too?
It's a real puzzle. And to make it even harder, philosophers came up with thought experiments about the brain, specifically about splitting or transplanting brain hemispheres. Imagine someone's brain hemispheres are separated, and each one is put into a different body. Would we then have two of the same person walking around?
Oh, okay, now that's getting a little freaky.
Yeah.
If one half of the brain is enough to be you, what happens if there are two? Does the original person disappear?
These are the kinds of questions that really get philosophers going. These thought experiments, even though they're pretty out there, make us think about what truly makes us, us. How much is tied to the physical brain? How much is about our psychology? There are so many different opinions on this.
Well, don't leave me hanging. How do philosophers even try to understand these brain-splitting scenarios? It sounds impossible.
One way is to kind of tweak the memory criterion. Instead of focusing on specific memories, they focus on a more general idea of psychological continuity. Even if I can't remember every detail of being 5 years old, there's a connection between my mental states now and back then my beliefs, desires, personality, that kind of thing.
So it's not about remembering everything, but more like having this psychological thread that runs through our lives, connecting different versions of ourselves.
That's it. It's called the psychological continuity criterion. It says that this ongoing connection is what matters, even if some memories are lost or changed over time.
That makes sense. It feels more like how we actually experience ourselves, right? We're always changing, but still feel connected to who we were before.
Yeah.
But what about those brain-splitting thought experiments? Does that still cause problems for psychological continuity?
Yeah, it definitely makes things complicated. If you have two separate streams of consciousness from the same original person, can both really be psychologically continuous with the original. This is where some really wild philosophical theories come in.
All right, lay it on me. I'm ready for the really wild stuff.
Okay, so one philosopher, David Lewis, had this idea that in these brain-splitting cases, there were actually two distinct individuals all along, even before the split.
Wait, what? So there were two selves in one body. That sounds like science fiction.
It does, right. But Lewis argued that these two individuals were just so closely connected, so similar, that they basically seemed like one person. The brain split just made it obvious.
So it's not that one person becomes two, but two hidden people become separate. What other explanations are there?
Well, another philosopher, Robert Nozick, thought of personal identity as a sort of competition.
A competition. I've never heard of that. How does that work?
He said if you transplant one side of the brain, the new person is the same as the original. But if you transplant both sides and make two people, neither is identical to the original.
So it's like only one can win the who's the real person game. Only one can be the true continuation.
Yeah, that's the main idea of Nozick's view. He's saying personal identity isn't just about psychological continuity, but also about whether someone else is claiming that identity too. One candidate is easy, but multiple candidates, that's where it gets tricky.
This is blowing my mind.
Huh.
It sounds like personal identity isn't fixed, but a constantly changing thing that can go in unexpected directions.
You're getting it. And that brings us to Derek Parfit, who really changed how we think about personal identity. He made a distinction between survival and identity.
So you can survive without being the same as your past self. How does that even work?
Well, Parfit said that psychological continuity is about survival, not necessarily about strict identity. In the brain split case, he'd say the original person survives in both of the new people because they're both connected to the original. But neither new person is identical to the original person.
Wow, that's deep. So parts of me can keep going even if there's no single unchanged me. That's a lot to think about.
It is a pretty big idea. Parfit argued that we shouldn't be so focused on this idea of one unchanging self. What matters is how rich and connected our mental lives are, all the experiences that make up our story.
It's like we're less like statues and more like rivers, always changing but still flowing continuously. This is really changing how I think about being a person.
That's what philosophy is all about. It challenges how we think and shows us new perspectives. But all this talk about the mind, it might make you wonder, what about the body? Does that play a role in personal identity at all?
Right. Some people might say you can't be the same person if you don't have the same body.
Yeah.
What do philosophers think about that?
There are lots of views on this too. Some philosophers, like Eric Olson, say we've been looking at this the wrong way the whole time. He thinks we're basically animals.
Animals, you mean I'm not like a mind or a soul, just a biological organism?
That's what Olson argues. He says our biological continuity, staying alive as a creature, is what's at the root of our identity. Psychological continuity is just a side effect of that.
So back to the basics. We're just fancy animals that think and feel. But who we are comes down to our biology.
It's one way of thinking about it. Of course, philosophers are still debating all of this. They're constantly exploring these questions of consciousness, personal identity, and what it means to be human in a world that's always changing.
Well, after all this, I don't think I'll ever see myself, or even my coffee cup, the same way again. Identity is way more complicated and more interesting than I thought.
What's so cool is that these thought experiments, these abstract philosophical ideas, actually connect to something very real about our existence. We're always changing, and understanding identity helps us make sense of it all. It helps us appreciate what it means to be alive.
So there you have it, everyone. We've gone from ancient Greek paradoxes to brain splitting and explored some truly mind-bending ideas. Hopefully we all understand ourselves and the world a little bit better now. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep thinking about these things, folks.